Picture this. A podcast booth. One microphone. No PR rep in the room. No carefully worded statement drafted by a team of lawyers. Just Sophie Cunningham, her thoughts, and the record button blinking red. Most athletes in that moment choose safety. They'd pick the comfortable word, the diplomatic non-answer, the smile that says nothing and protects everything. Sophie pressed record anyway. And what came out of that microphone didn't just shake the Indiana Fever locker room. It cracked the entire foundational league that had spent years carefully, painfully, brick by brick, building its image into something the world would finally take seriously. One sentence. Unfiltered, unscripted, unretractable. Before we get there, drop your answer in the comments right now. Was Sophie Cunningham brave for saying it out loud, or did she just hand the league's critics a weapon? I want your real take, not the safe one. Here's what most people still don't understand about Sophie Cunningham. She is not a fringe voice. She is not a backup player chasing a podcast audience to stay relevant. 6 seasons of professional basketball. A trade to the Indiana Fever that put her next to the most talked about player in women's sports, Caitlin Clark. Suddenly, Sophie wasn't just a teammate. She was a personality, a presence. The kind of player who plays like she has something to prove every single night, because she does. And that energy, it translated off the court in ways nobody predicted. Not only did Sophie become one of the most recognizable names attached to the Fever's historic 2024 run, but she also quietly built one of the most authentic platforms in the WNBA through her podcast. Show me something. No ghostwriting. No talking points. Just Sophie saying exactly what she thinks. That combination, credibility plus platform plus zero filter, made what happened next feel almost inevitable. Almost. So when the 2026 CBA negotiations between the WNBA and the players' union started collapsing in slow motion, everyone was watching. Free agency frozen. Expansion timelines delayed. Players left in professional limbo, not knowing where they'd be playing, or if a season would even happen on schedule. The frustration inside the league wasn't a secret. It was just unspoken, publicly at least. Then Sophie walked into that booth. She didn't rant. She didn't spiral. She made one precise, devastating observation, the kind that land harder because it's calm. She said the way the negotiation was dragging, the stalling, the back-and-forth theater of it all, was making the WNBA look like the laughingstock of sports. 6 words. Laughingstock of sports. From an active player. Think about the architecture of that moment. This isn't a retired athlete with nothing to lose. This isn't a media personality paid to be provocative. This is someone who laces up for this league, who fights for every minute of court time, who has dedicated years to making women's basketball matter in the mainstream sports conversation. And she just said publicly what the league spent enormous energy trying to keep in the locker room. But here's what nobody's talking about. What Sophie said after that comment. The part that came right after the laughingstock line. That's where the story actually gets complicated, because she wasn't just venting. She was pointing at something specific, something structural, something that exposes attention at the very heart of this league's biggest moment. And it involves a number, a very, very large number. 11 years, $2.2 billion. Let that land for a second. That is a television deal the WNBA signed. The agreement that was supposed to represent the league's coronation moment. The proof that women's basketball had finally, undeniably, arrived. Sports executives were celebrating. Owners were smiling. The headlines wrote themselves. The players were still on their 2020 contracts. That is not a typo. While the league was negotiating one of the most lucrative media rights deals in women's sports history, the athletes actually producing the product, the ones whose names were selling jerseys, filling arenas, and pulling millions of new eyeballs to sport, were still operating under terms agreed upon before Caitlin Clark had played a single professional minute, before attendance records were shattered, before the cultural moment that made that $2.2 billion deal possible in the first place. So ask yourself, who actually built that value? Here's what the numbers reveal when you put them side by side. WNBA revenue was climbing at a historic rate. Viewership was up. Merchandise was moving. The Portland Fire and Toronto Tempo expansion franchises were being welcomed into a league that suddenly felt like it had real momentum. And yet, when players sat down at the CBA negotiating table, what they found on the other side wasn't celebration. It was resistance, delay, a process that moved with the urgency of someone who already had what they needed. Free agency didn't just slow down. It froze entirely. Picture this. It's the start of 2026. You are a professional basketball player. Your contract is expired. You have spent the offseason working out, preparing, waiting for the call that tells you where you will spend the next chapter of your career. That call doesn't come. Not because teams aren't interested, but because the entire system governing player movement has been suspended mid-negotiation. You are in professional purgatory. Your life is on hold. And the league you built your identity around is locked in a public standoff that is playing out in real time on social media, on podcasts, on sports talk shows. That is not hypothetical. That was reality for dozens of WNBA players this offseason. Not only were free agency timelines pushed into uncertainty, but the expansion draft for Portland and Toronto were delayed as well, leaving two brand new franchises unable to build their rosters while clock on their inaugural seasons kept ticking. The operational damage was real. The human cost was real. And the optics? The optics were exactly what Sophie Cunningham described. Chaotic, embarrassing, laughingstock territory. The players weren't asking for the moon. They were asking for a share of the world they created. If the gap between that $2.2 billion deal and what landed in the players' pocket surprised you, you already understand exactly why hitting subscribe matters. This story is far from over, and the next part gets even more revealing. Don't miss it. Now here's where the narrative gets more complicated than most coverage is willing to admit, because the WNBA's position in these negotiations wasn't purely about greed. There were structural arguments being made about league sustainability, about the gap between revenue and profitability across franchises, about the long-term cost of expanding too fast. Some of those arguments had merit, but Sophie Cunningham wasn't interested in the PR version of those arguments. She was interested in what the players were actually experiencing. The stalling, the silence, the feeling that the people generating the product were being treated as an afterthought in the conversation about its value. And she said it. Not in a closed meeting, not in a leaked text, not through a players' union statement crafted to sound measured and reasonable. She said it into a microphone, on her own platform, in her own words, which means the league now had a problem it could not ignore. Because Sophie Cunningham saying the WNBA looks like the laughingstock of sports isn't just a quote, it's a headline. It travels. It gets clipped. It gets reacted to on YouTube. It gets debated on sports radio. It becomes a story instead of the negotiation itself. And the question every executive in the league's offices had to be asking in the hours after that episode dropped was simple and brutal. Do we respond, or does silence make it worse? What they chose to do next, and what it triggered inside the players' union, is something that genuinely nobody saw coming. And one name kept surfacing in the conversations that followed. A name that changes the entire shape of the story. There is a specific kind of silence that isn't peace. It isn't agreement. It isn't neutrality. It's the silence of an institution deciding how much a problem is worth acknowledging, calculating whether a response elevates the criticism or buries it. The WNBA had heard Sophie Cunningham's laughingstock comment. Every executive, every owner, every communications director had seen the clip, and for a moment, they chose that silence. That silence lasted exactly long enough to make everything worse. Here's something the mainstream coverage keeps glossing over. Sophie Cunningham has a documented history of saying the uncomfortable thing at the uncomfortable time and being right. When teammates were playing diplomatic, Sophie was playing honest. When the league narrative was carefully managed, Sophie was on her podcast, dismantling it with the calm precision of someone who has simply stopped caring about the consequences of telling the truth. This wasn't a personality malfunction. This was a pattern. And anyone paying attention to her career should have seen this moment coming from miles away. The league, apparently, was not paying close enough attention. When the WNBA did respond, not with a press release, not with a direct rebuttal, but through carefully placed comments in league-friendly media, the framing was predictable. Both sides are working in good faith. Progress is being made. The league is committed to its players. It was the institutional version of a non-answer, polished, measured, completely disconnected from what players were actually living through in real time. One former player and analyst, speaking to reporters covering the labor situation, described the league's posture as treating urgency like an inconvenience. Not a direct quote, a sentiment, but a sentiment that landed because it matched exactly what Sophie had said in plainer language. The institution was moving at its own pace. The players were left absorbing the cost of that pace. And then the locker rooms started talking. Not publicly, not yet, but inside the players' community, on group chats, in training facilities, in the quiet conversations that happen when cameras aren't rolling. Sophie's comments weren't being treated as a controversy. They were being treated as a relief. Because someone had finally said it. Someone had taken the weight of the unsaid thing and just put it down on the table, out loud, for everyone to see. Was every player ready to use the word laughingstock themselves? No. Some had more to lose. Some were closer to free agency. Some had endorsement situations that required a more careful public posture. But the underlying frustration? Unanimous. The sense that the league's negotiating timeline was disrespecting the very players whose star power had made the $2.2 billion deal possible? Unanimous. Sophie hadn't broken rank. She had named the rank that already existed. Here's the twist that reframes everything said so far. The WNBA's labor situation in 2026 isn't just a negotiation dispute. It is a power shift happening in real time, and the league's leadership may not fully understand yet that the balance has changed. Because something is different about this generation of WNBA players that wasn't true 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. They have platforms, real ones, independently built. Sophie Cunningham's podcast reaches an audience that doesn't need the league's media apparatus to tell them what to think. Caitlin Clark's cultural footprint operates entirely outside the WNBA's control. Breanna Stewart, Sabrina Ionescu, Aya Wilson, these aren't just athletes anymore. They are media entities. And media entities don't need permission to speak. That structural shift is what makes Sophie's comment so significant beyond the quote itself. It signals that the old dynamic, where the league controls a narrative and players operate within it, is functionally over. The players have microphones now, and they know how to use them, which brings us to the name that keeps surfacing. The person whose position in all of this is more complicated, more powerful, and more fascinating than anyone has properly examined. And when you understand their role and what comes next, the entire story changes shape. Every revolution in professional sports has a hinge point, a moment you can point back to later and say, that's where the old way ended. Not with a press conference, not with a signed agreement, with one person on one microphone saying a thing that couldn't be unsaid. The WNBA has had its hinge point, and the league's biggest mistake right now would be treating Sophie Cunningham's words as a PR problem instead of a signal. Because signals ignored have a way of becoming crises. Here's the overlooked mistake the league keeps making, and has been making for years beneath the surface of every positive headline. The WNBA consistently conflates the league's growth story with the players' growth story, as if they are the same thing. They are not. A $2.2 billion television deal is the league's growth story. A player sleeping on a host family's couch during her rookie season because her salary doesn't cover an apartment. That is the player's growth story. Both can be true simultaneously. Both have been true simultaneously. And as long as the institution keeps presenting one as evidence of the other, the disconnect that Sophie name will keep festering underneath every record attendance number and every glowing press release. The gap isn't just financial, it's philosophical. Not only has that philosophical gap produced labor friction, but has quietly been building a generation of players who have psychologically separated their identity from the league's identity. 5 years ago, a WNBA player's brand was largely inseparable from the league's brand. Today, that is simply not true. Sophie Cunningham's audience follows Sophie Cunningham. Caitlin Clark's audience follows Caitlin Clark. The players have outgrown the promotional infrastructure the league built around them, and nobody in a position of institutional power seems willing to say that plainly. Sophie said it plainly. That's why the clip traveled. Now, picture what 2026 actually looks like if this isn't resolved with genuine urgency. 2 expansion franchises, Portland and Toronto, entering their inaugural seasons under a cloud of labor uncertainty, trying to build fan bases while foundational rules of the league remain unsettled. Veteran players entering prime earning years with no clarity on contracts. Young players watching negotiation play out and quietly recalibrating how much loyalty they owe an institution that moved as slowly when it mattered most. And a global audience, one that the $2.2 billion deal was specifically designed to capture and grow. Watching a league that just had its biggest cultural moment stumble through a self-inflicted crisis. That audience does not wait. Momentum is not patient. But here is the insight that almost nobody is centering in this conversation, and it might be the most important one. Sophie Cunningham's laughingstock comment was not just a criticism. Underneath the frustration, underneath the bluntness, was something that only someone who genuinely loves a thing would bother to say. You don't call something a laughingstock and then walk away from it. You call it that because you want it to be better, because you have watched it inch toward greatness, and you cannot stomach seeing it undercut itself at the worst possible moment. That is not the voice of someone abandoning the league. That is the voice of someone refusing to let the league abandon itself. The WNBA stands at an intersection it has never stood at before. More money, more eyes, more talent, more platforms, more leverage on every side of every table. The ingredients for something genuinely historic are all present. What Sophie Cunningham did, uncomfortable as it was, disruptive as it was hold a mirror up at the exact moment the league most needed to see its own reflection clearly. Whether the people with the power to act on that reflection are willing to look. That is the question that 2026 will answer. And the players? They already know what they see. 3 things will stay with you from this story. First, the gap between the league's revenue and its players' reality is not just a labor issue. It is a credibility issue. Second, when players have their own platforms, institutional silence is no longer a strategy. Third, the most dangerous voice in any negotiation is the one that doesn't need permission to speak. Sophie Cunningham had all 3 of those things when she walked into that booth. The WNBA is still calculating what to do about it. Keep watching this space, because the next move determines whether this league's biggest error becomes its defining one or its cautionary tale.